Authority gives me instructions.
This is the final battle.
The House of the Dead remake is an embarrassing update for one of the best of the old school arcade rail shooters, and more evidence as to why developers need to stop outsourcing these things to third-party companies.
What is that?
It's just been released exclusively for the Nintendo Switch, and I'd say it's a cash grab, only I'm not really sure if that's an accurate statement, because I just don't know who this game is even supposed to be really appealing to. I mean, are there really that many OG House of the Dead fans who own a Nintendo Switch? Now, the original House of the Dead, along with Resident Evil, is credited for really helping to popularize zombie-themed games in the mid-90s. And along with Virtua Cop and Time Crisis, it was also one of those light gun games that started steering the genre into fully 3D environments. It was hardly a timeless masterpiece, but it's got its place in gaming history. And no doubt there's countless people out there, like myself, who have their own fond memories of playing through it.
Sophie!
The story is you're playing as either Agent Thomas Rogan or Agent G, working for the AMS, and heading into a mansion full of zombies and other horrific creatures, all the creations of an evil scientist named Dr. Curian.
I really respect your consistency.
You had zombies coming at you with axes, chainsaws, and barrels. There were guys hanging upside down from the ceiling, there were Freddy Krueger-looking monsters with machetes, along with slugs, frogs, monkeys, and bats. And it was all kinda similar to Resident Evil. Just replace Rogan and G with Chris and Jill, and all these zombies with the ones created by the T-Virus. The final boss in both games was also a super powerful creature that attacked its creator moments after coming to life.
I shall destroy everything.
Zap you, goddamn!
Compared to Resident Evil though, House of the Dead was way more fast-paced and much more violent. In fact, I can remember that back in the day, they used to put a black curtain around the arcade cabinets to protect our young, fragile minds from whatever horrors lurked behind it. Overall, it was a simple premise, but fun enough to play through, and kinda stupidly hard as a lot of arcade games tended to be. Prior to this remake, the only way to really play this game was with that really bad PC port, if you can somehow get it running at a whopping 640 by 320 resolution by the way, but this version lacks music and it looks considerably worse than the arcade. Other than that, there's the Saturn port, which is more or less the same as the PC version, just far clunkier to play through. And then if all else fails, you could download an arcade emulator and just play through it that way, which I'd honestly argue is the best and most faithful way to do it, and it manages to capture those seizure-inducing screen flashes perfectly. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned this earlier too, but this video ain't for the faint of heart, man, or people vulnerable to flashing lights, most of whom I'm gonna assume are probably dead by now if they're still watching. Anyway, instead of just updating or remastering this old version, which is really all they would have needed to do, they've instead opted to rebuild the entire thing from the ground up, recreating the entire game with new visuals, new music, and new voice acting. Or at least palm that process off to Megapixel Studios.
Thank you.
I do think it's kind of weird though that they chose to remake this one and this one alone, considering I think most people would probably agree that the second game is the best in the series. I mean, just for the writing and the voice acting alone. It makes Resident Evil look like Macbeth in comparison.
I don't care if you people try to get in my way or not. In time you'll find out who's right.
Instead though, we get this thing. That's a really good example of why these developers need to stop palming these off to people who have nothing to do with the original product. Just feels like a half-assed remake at times, or which happens to be running on the Unity engine, because, I mean, it was either going to be that or the Unreal Engine 4, right? Even down to the simple overlooked errors like spelling and grammar mistakes in the subtitles and the loading screens.
What happened? What happened?
Now, as for the game itself, House of the Dead was really a product of its time, in the way that it was an arcade shooter with its sole objective being getting the money out of your pockets and into its dirty slots. You then move through 4 levels, all featuring different areas of the mansion, shooting every zombie and monster in your way, along with trying to rescue scientists from being killed, who'd often reward you with health kits.
Use this.
That's no mean feat though, because the zombies are going to beeline towards these guys first and foremost, so saving all of them was pretty damn tricky. Then at the end of each level, you'd be up against a boss, which had a weak spot you'd need to target and shoot a couple of 100 times to kill it. So many times that by the end of the fight, you'd probably have repetitive strain injury. The final level then pulled the old boss rush bullshit to try to squeeze out as much cash as it possibly could, which is a design principle they also implemented for the final boss. But what made House of the Dead really cool for the time though was that it had multiple routes through these levels. Throughout each of these levels you'd come to these areas where you could choose to go in different directions, shooting a trapdoor on the floor for instance, or whether to go up or down on an elevator, and these snap decisions would then change the areas you went to for the next couple of minutes. I mean, it wasn't a huge impact on the level overall, and you'd still end up at a boss fight that left you with carpal tunnel syndrome, but it was a nice inclusion. Considering most other rail shooters at the time were pretty much completely straightforward, hence being called rail shooters. Plus there was even multiple endings depending on the score you got. It almost kind of has to be played with a second person. The enemy count isn't always scaled for one player, and with two people it makes it a lot easier to manage all of these threats. Like if there's zombies on both the left and the right side of the screen, each player can manage their own side, and that's always been part of the fun of playing this thing in the arcade. Trying to micromanage threats on your side of the screen, but then also keeping an eye out on what your mate is dealing with and seeing if he needs a helping hand too. They've even made that more prominent now with this new Horde mode, which is an alternate game mode that's basically the exact same, only it adds in far more enemies. You know, in case you weren't getting arthritis fast enough by playing the game as it is and wanted to speed along that goddamn process.
Oh, shit!
It's just that nothing's really been done here to make any of this feel like an improved experience, and in a lot of ways, it's actually kind of worse off. Visually, I think the whole thing looks like an early PlayStation 3 game with really crappy textures and basic modeling for all these various enemies.
I was so scared.
They've tried to keep the look of the original enemies the same, and I think in most cases they have pulled that off, but everything looks like it's covered in baby oil and it's all just super shiny. Now look, only the most hardcore contrarian would pretend that the old game still looks good. I mean, it definitely has its own unique art style, but it looks like a 16-year-old game through and through, so it was ripe for being redone here. It's just, I feel like the way that it's turned out here really is one of those instances where it looks like you're playing a fake game. Do you know what I mean? You know in TV shows and movies where there's like a kid playing a video game in the background, and because they can't get the license to show a real game, they just make up some fake looking one to use instead. This is what that looks like to me, man. It's just got this very fake and almost artificial look to the whole thing, totally lacking that grit of the original game. And I know that the Nintendo Switch ain't really a juggernaut when it comes to visuals or the hardware, but even for the Switch, this is just really crappy looking stuff.
What happened?
To me, it looks like it's on about the same level of visual detail as House of the Dead Overkill, and I mean at this point, I'm comparing a 2022 game to something released back in 2009. Normally I'd say that graphics don't matter, only this is a remake, and one of the main points of scrutiny for a remake is how the whole thing looks and how it's been updated for this new platform.
Thank you.
Now there is the option of a performance mode in here, which removes a lot of the visual bells and whistles to maintain a better frame rate, supposedly. But the only real difference I can see between having this on and off outside of the performance is some of the screen effects, like lens flare, along with shadows and these other lighting effects. Outside of someone doing a full breakdown of how each mode performs though, to me, they really seem to be neck and neck, and the frame rate is just dog shit regardless. I do like some of the updated creatures though. I think the hangman boss you fight in the second level actually looks really awesome now. The moon hanging low in the sky behind him and that subtle glow across his winged figure just looks cool. For the fight against the Hermit too, this whole area is now covered in cobwebs, which makes me hate fucking spiders even more than I already did, if that was even possible. But a lot of the other new modeling and environments just seem really half-assed to me, and it really just doesn't look all that great. The other crappy element here too is the ragdoll death animations, and watching a zombie awkwardly tumble to the ground and fold into itself is just laughable. Look, I'm just going to come out and say it, preset death animations are always going to be better than just some crappy physics system applied to something and calling it a day. And this remake is a testament to that. But by far the worst thing about this remake are the controls, which are just utterly fucking awful.
Don't worry, he'll pay for this.
Now, I don't spend all that much time playing Switch games. In fact, you can count the amount of them I've played on one hand, including this remake. But I don't think I'm at a line here saying that this game just controls like dog shit. It's a rail shooter series with arcade roots, so ideally you want to be playing this thing with a light gun. But in lieu of that, you've got a couple of options here, the first being gyro aiming, which is by aiming this cigarette lighter size controller at the screen and then clicking the trigger like a madman the entire time. If you are going to do this, I'd recommend turning on auto reloading. I mean, it might make you feel like a filthy casual, but it's far smoother than having to press a reload button every 2 seconds, believe me. The problem is that your crosshair is constantly moving across the screen, forcing you to keep recalibrating it literally every couple of seconds. And there doesn't seem to be any reason as to why this keeps happening. Recalibrating is as simple as pressing the thumbstick down, which recenters the crosshair to the middle of the screen. And yeah, get used to pressing that thumbstick, man, because you're going to be doing it an absolute shitload. Now, I've tried a bunch of things I read online to fix this. I've tried hard resetting the console, putting the controller down on a flat surface, recalibrating it in the system settings, and none of that stuff seemed to make a difference. So I'm just really kind of starting to think that this is an issue with the game itself, in which case that's just complete rubbish. In a shooting game where the difference between taking a hit or not is dilly-dallying for less than a second, and your crosshair is constantly sliding to the side of the screen, well, it makes for a lot of frustrating moments. It's a hard enough game to begin with, and I don't need my crosshair yeeting across the screen all the time to make it even worse. The other option is aiming manually with the thumbstick, and yeah, I don't think I even need to tell you why that's a bad idea. Playing a light gun game with a controller should really be the last resort, but even then, I'd probably just advise not doing it at all. It all just makes me wonder why they didn't release this for the PC. I mean, although PCs don't fully have light gun support either, playing it with a mouse would be a whole lot better than struggling with this gyro aiming bullshit. And I think this is really one of the Remake's biggest downfalls, because having to constantly worry about where your bullets are going almost takes up as much mental fortitude as it does dispatching these enemies to begin with. I mean, that's really the most important aspect of a shooter, is shooting things. There's a lot of controller options here to mess around with, from crosshair size, the opacity, through to things like the aim assist, but none of this seemed to fix that god-awful calibration. And it honestly just kind of made it unplayable for me sometimes. I've played a whole lot of light gun games on a lot of different consoles, and I gotta say, this is definitely one of the worst. I've even still got my original GunCon 45 that came with my copy of Time Crisis 1. Yeah, I'm that old. You can go out and hammer nails with this thing all day, come back, and it's going to cut dead center on target every time. Here though, I stopped to scratch my nose or blink, and the Switch controller's suddenly off the edge of my TV. Maybe they did it ironically in like a throwback way, like back when you were a kid at a birthday party somewhere, your hands slick with pizza grease and your lips still wet with soda. Maybe it was all intentional. Nah, they just fucked up.
You done fucked up now!
The final nail in the coffin for me with this remake is the lack of content. So you've got the main arcade mode itself, which can be played on different difficulty modes and offers up those alternate routes, but really that's about a 30 or so minute long ride either way. There's 2 different scoring modes too, classic and arcade, but as far as I can tell, the arcade mode just tallies up kill combos, and I have no idea what that's affecting outside of your score. There is an armory feature where if you rescue every single scientist in the game, you can gain access to new weapons once you then find and collect them at key points in each chapter. But even then, to use them, you still need to have rescued every single scientist in the game. And it's like, do they have any idea how hard it is to do that?
Thank you.
Yeah, let's hide what would have been one of the most fun new features behind what's arguably one of the hardest achievements. Good one. I mean, how about just basic weapon selection in the game menu? The original PC port had this added mode where you could play as different characters who had weapons that did different damage, had faster or slower reload times, and a wider or smaller shot radius. I mean, at this point, a 20-year-old lazy PC port has more options for the player than a 2022 remake does. How about just being able to spend your points earned at the end of a run to buy new weapons? Yeah, how about that? House of the Dead Overkill had this kind of system, and not only did it make the game more enjoyable for multiple playthroughs, but it just encouraged replayability, because you actually had something to work towards and achieve in the form of all these unlockable guns, instead of gatekeeping it behind this really tough achievement, the likes of which most people I doubt would even bother with. This all might be fine if this was like a $15 game or something, which it really should have been, all things considered. But yet, in Australia, they're charging $55 dues for this thing. I mean, with that kind of money, I could get a quarter tank of gas or a plate of smashed avocados on toast.
Eating a meal, a succulent Chinese meal.
The price tag might be fine if you can see yourself playing through this thing with a mate when you've got like half an hour to kill. But even then, there's no real reason to ever come back to it. After finishing it a couple of times and messing around with these new game modes, I really felt like everything was done and dusted. And even though I got my copy for free, I still wanted my money back. Part of me hopes they can go back and remake the second game because the camp factor in that game is through the roof.
Who rules over nature.
And honestly, the more people that know about Goldman, the better.
To protect the life cycle.
But if this is what we're in store for, well, then maybe it's better being left in the past. If nothing else though, I hope this does help to grow interest in these old light gun games, and if they ever want to take a stab at bringing Time Crisis or other obscure shooters like Carnival to a newer audience, only doing it properly this time, well, I'll be the first one in line. For this remake though, I say lock those mansion doors back up and leave it be.